Okay, while we have people joining us online, I'd just like to welcome you all back to webinar 3 in this very important and informative series that we're running on livestock thermal stress, our Thriving Through Change, Managing Livestock Thermal Stress Before It Costs You. This learning series is brought to you by the University of Southern Queensland's Northern Australian Climate Program in conjunction with the University of Queensland's Gatton Livestock Research Team and the Southern Queensland Northern New South Wales Innovation Hub. The Northern Australian Climate Program is funded by Meat and Livestock Australia and the Drought and Climate Adaptation Program. Before we do get started today, I just have some news. We just need to inform you all that we've had to postpone the field days that we were planning for next week for Blackall and Meandara, unfortunately. However, we're going to pivot and we are going to run a 4th webinar in this series, and it will be a very interactive Q&A session. So those questions and answers that you've been posting in your registration and through the chat and surveys, we will go through each of those, and you'll actually be able to talk with the panelists, our expert panelists. So that was initially going to be in the field days, but we'll bring that to you. We're also going to have the NACPI team go through the latest seasonal outlook and what that can mean in terms of livestock thermal stress in this upcoming spring and early summer season. And we're also going to hear some very interesting research that's being done by Dr. Rachel Taylor on those trends, climate trends, and how they may likely impact on livestock thermal stress going forward. So to get started today, I do want to encourage you to please, you'll probably see a poll popping up there on your computer screens. I do ask you to please please participate in the polls and the survey at the end of the day. Not only does it help us to better understand and address from a research perspective the impacts livestock thermal stress is having on production systems, it also does help us to demonstrate the value of the learning series like this to our funding partners. As I've mentioned in previous webinars, I'm sure whether you're a sheep or cattle producer or you're working in the livestock extension and consultancy realm, that not only today but the whole series, there's new insights into strategies for better managing thermal stress in your livestock production system. So in today's webinar, we're going to look a lot at the genetics, phenotype and epigenetics and what that means. But to kick things off, we are going to start with Dr. Kieran McCosker, and we're going to look at how livestock thermal stress likely impacts livestock productivity and performance and some of those learnings from the Car for Life project. So Kieran, I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you. First of all, apologies everyone for last week with the internet issues, but look forward to giving this presentation today and look forward to your questions later on. As we heard last week, John and others provided a good summary of the impacts on more intensive production systems, and I've been tasked with doing a similar presentation for the grazing cattle side of things. So firstly, when this changes, there we go. What is the risk of heat stress in our beef grazing situation? So this is some data that we've got out of the Car for Life project, and within that project we have 12 collaborating sites across essentially Queensland and parts of the Northern Territory. And regardless of what threshold you use at each of those sites, basically cattle in Northern Australia are regularly subjected to some form of high heat load using those current thresholds. Now, part of this project, we're trying to quantify what that impact is from a performance and a production point of view. And of course, heat stress or heat load or whatever it is, how we want to term it, is not a new topic that we're talking about. So if I go back to the literature, one of the earlier sort of studies I found was in 1963, where they were establishing trees in the Barclay tableland trying to mitigate the heat stress effects. And then they followed up with calf, looking at impacts on calf survival, and they had the shorter shade structures. And then in the background of this image, you can see one of the feedlot grade sort of feedlot structures that was installed for a project that I'll elaborate on a little bit later. So just to summarise what's been presented in the past, and I won't, in our past webinars, and I won't delve into this too much, but essentially, what are the production impacts? Growth, Ange and John have provided good summaries on the reduction in feed intake and feed conversion efficiencies as a response to the heat load, and obviously that's associated with reduction in growth rates and marbling and other impacts. Now, these are all theoretical things that have been documented in the literature and have largely been documented in the more intensive industries such as feedlots and dairies. Now, in the beef grazing situation, obviously there's some vast differences. For instance, the nutritional plane is much lower generally. So we don't have production feeding. The digestibility of the pasture is lower, and potentially they're not. There's more space to provide animals, and there's shade available, but we don't really know if the current thresholds are appropriate, and that's our focus of the research at the moment. Now, with the reproduction and neonatal consequences side of things, we have seen in dairy and research in Brazil and other parts of the world, there's a reduction in estrus expression, and as a consequence of that, there's lower conception rates, and there is also some evidence of increased embryonic mortality as a consequence of the physiological changes and reduction in blood flow going to the uterus and uterine support. From the male reproduction side of things, if a bull becomes compromised from a heat load point of view, there's some nice evidence out there about animals not being able to regulate their body temperature well, and a reduction in semen quality. Obviously, also there's going to be behavioural changes as a bull becomes hot with reduced libido and things like that. So the likely consequences of those things are reduction in pregnancy rates and general reproductive performance. From the calf survival aspect, we know from a lot of recent studies that our major risk period is at the time of birth around calves. That's when we know that their risk of dying is much higher. Typically 50% or nearly 2/3 of calves deaths occur within the first week after birth. And we are particularly interested in what is the impact of heat load around that time of the calving event. Is that cow's compromised if she's hot already and she goes into labour? If the calf is born into really hot conditions and it also faces a reduction in appetite and then doesn't have the colostrum intake in the first 24 hours, does that have a consequence of developing immunological responses and subject to death later on? And also, as we described before, cows typically will probably have a reduction in feed intake, and that's going to have a consequence in milk yield and milk quality. The other thing, of course, is that cows, there is some evidence out there that cows that are heat stressed, with their reduced uterine support, give birth to lower body weight or calf birth weights of calves, and that has been shown to have some impact on calf survival in other studies as well. So these are all the things that there's evidence out there to say that we should be concerned about, and I'm now going to sort of describe some of the work that we've been doing to look at within the production systems to see if we can, what is the data supporting those associations. So this is some work that's come out of the Calf Live project, and this is a figure of showing the distance walked. So within this study, about 1,000 cows have been tracked with GPS collars, and this is the association between total distance walked over a day in kilometres in relation to maximum temperature humidity index for that day. So what you can see there is there's a reduction in how much an animal walks for a hotter day. So essentially, on a very hot day, a cow typically walks less than a cooler day. Now, what are they doing with their time if they're not walking? So if we actually look at the resting time for an individual in relation to the maximum temperature humidity index over a whole day, there's no association there. So essentially, this is again within the Calf Alive data set. Generally, the cows typically spend the same proportion of time resting or staying static, regardless of temperature humidity index for that day, for the data that we have observed in the range of temperature humidity index that we've observed in the study. But if we partition this data into nighttime and daytime, what we see is around the 78 or 80 degree or 80 THI of 80 threshold, there's a change in behaviour. So what we see is that the proportion of time resting increases during the daytime and decreases during the nighttime for days that have those high temperatures. So essentially what we're documenting here is a shift in behaviour. So there's a diurnal shift in the cows are actually spending their daytime, the majority, or increasing the amount of resting they perform during the daytime, and reducing the amount they do in the nighttime because they are shifting in grazing. So in cooler times, cows typically graze both day and night, and we've got some other data there that's suggesting this, but what we see is there's a shift in grazing, spending majority of their time at night time while it's cooler, they're doing their grazing in the more favourable conditions. And during the daytime, they're actually resting or spending their time elsewhere. So we saw before, and this is another some data from another project that I was associated with, which is the Cool Calves project, which was done in the Barkly tableland. And this is also documenting the difference in the amount of time a cow will spend out in the open away from shade for the different times of the day, with and without access to shade. So what we see there is when a cow has access to shade, they're spending less time out in the open during the early morning in the daytime when the shade is available. And elaborating on this a bit more in the high heat load events, so as with increasing heat load index, which is slightly different to the temperature humidity index, what you see there is the amount of time a cow is spending within or close proximity to the water point is relatively constant when they have a lot of shade available. But when there is limited shade available, cows typically, with increasing temperature, they're spending an increasing amount of time close to water. So what I believe is happening in this situation is that the cooling mechanisms, which Ange and John elaborated on earlier series of the webinars, what the animals are doing in this situation is they're being close proximity to the water point and consuming increased amount of water and some of the evaporation associated or shade around the water points and different things is their mechanism to cool when they don't have shade available. So you can see there in a very high heat load index that an animal is spending up to 20% of their time over a day next to water and really high temperature index. That to PHI. So what can we do about this? There was a study done which was called the Reducing Calf Loss from Exposure Study, or the Cool Calves Project. And what this study did was, over 3 years, there was 3 management groups of approximately 250 cows, and one management group of cows had access to the shade structure or shade provided at each water point, similar to in the photo there. They're about, I think they're about 14 by 25 metres and about 5 metres high. And the other paddock, comparison paddock, didn't have those that infrastructure installed. So after 3 years, what we observed was around a 5.9%, close to 6% lower calf loss, but that wasn't statistically significant. It was approaching, we use a p-value of 0.05, and in this study, we observed one at 0.08. So we are working with the company a little bit longer to see, to gain confidence if that p-value actually crosses that statistical threshold of 0.05, or we get a bit more confidence to say that this is not a real intervention. But even though we observed this production impact on the fetal and calf loss, in this study we didn't observe any difference in pregnancy within 4 months, and we did not observe any difference in the weaning rate of the calves produced by the cows in either paddock when we compared them. So this study also was done in Wagyu cattle, which are black cattle in the Barkly tableland, and they experienced some periods of really high heat load. So the other study that we I'll draw on today is a study that was is the Sweet Spot project, where we had it's a retrospective analysis of existing data sets where we had information on the paddock, and we interpolated weather data for the years that we had the data for, and we ended up with a data set of about 25 breeder herds, and the data sets expand for about 30 years. In this study, we had all these herds were pregnancy tested, and we had an estimated month of calving for these herds. And I was interested to look at what, if any, association with the climatic factors for the month of calving and fetal and calf loss. So we went through a modelling exercise. We ended up with about 27,000 calf outcomes for calf loss. Each cow contributed around 2 years of data. And in the modelling exercise, we found that all the typical sort of factors became important. So animal class, body condition score, when they calved, if they had previously calved before, the stocking rate within the paddock, and the region was also important. But in this study, we did not find a clear association between a comprehensive climatic index of a threshold for heat stress, heat load, and in calf survival. Now, this may be counterintuitive findings, but it also indicates a complex relationship that we are really looking for within our production systems. So what we feel for future recommendations or future research is that we probably need a more finer scale method to see what the actual impact of these heat load events are in our beef grazing situations. And we feel that a monthly average is probably not going to pick it up. So future research, we hope to have the actual environmental conditions at the time of calving and really tease out what that impact is, or even within the preceding week or a few days prior to calving, is where our future research directions are. So I'm going to leave you with a few questions and where our research, and this is also sort of highlighted where our research is going to go in the future. But we want to define what the optimal conditions are. You know, if an animal's not eating or not performing, there's probably likely to be genetic expression issues. You know, so if an animal is suffering under these heat-loaded conditions, how do we define that that animal is suffering or not coping with these environmental conditions so that we can breed future sort of resilient animals that are highly productive into the future? As I sort of alluded to, we know that our cattle are getting exposed to high heat load conditions quite regularly. But you know, how do we measure, and is there an impact on our production, and what is the unit that we need to be investigating to quantify that? Now, these interactions, we suspect that this is probably a pretty complex situation, and there's probably going to be certain conditions that we need to consider. One thing that we haven't probably considered a lot is that there's probably going to be differences between land types. For instance, if you've got a rocky outcrop or a paddock that's not well covered with pasture, those animals are probably going to be experiencing a higher heat load than those that are grazing a paddock that is well covered with forage and pasture. So what I'm saying is that even though we're talking a lot about the production consequences and impacts on our animals, you know, we probably do need to be considered approach, particularly with the level of development and performance that are currently within our businesses already. So even though you know, heat and shade structures that we install across the Northern Australia a little bit more than previously, which is a good thing, and there's likely to be welfare impacts for that. I suggest that we, you know, we need to have a considered approach with our infrastructure and investments moving forward, and it's got to be in combination with water point and other management to support all of the different management interventions that are occurring in balance with one another. So that's me, Vicky. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kieran. It's always very informative when you talk, and I think that the research that you're doing and with the Car for Life project and the findings, it's exciting to see. So hopefully everyone will be getting along to Longreach in November for that day to look at some of those findings more in depth in November there. I'm going to hand over now to Professor John Goggin. And Kieran, I'll just get you to stop sharing your screen there, mate, and we'll jump into John's presentation. Over
Thanks,
to
Vicky.
you, John.
Yep, let's share my screen. You can see that okay?
Yep, can see that great, John.
Good, thanks. Okay, so hello, everyone. So Kieran just finished with some questions, and I'm actually going to start with questions. I really don't have the answers to this at this point in time, but I'll pose questions and it'll open up for some discussion, which we can talk about at the next webinar. But the first thing to think about is if we think we need to make or have genetic change to develop more resilient animals, how much time do we have to make that change to meet whatever the variation in climate that's coming or is already here, and how's that going to impact on what we want to do? So thinking about if we want to look at the type of animals we're going to have in, say, 2050, which is 25 years from now, which is 300 months. So that's, if we're breeding to that sort of a time frame, we've got 25 years to make the type of changes we think we require. So a couple of questions, and then after I finish this session, I'll go into a bit more detail on some of the ways maybe we can answer some of these. The first question is, and this is one that's come up a fair bit when talking to people, is, they say, why should we really bother about it? Shouldn't we just accept it, that the change is happening or the variations there, and we'll just continue business as usual in terms of our genetic improvement programs. We're not going to select for anything different to what we're already doing. The other question that comes up is if we are going to look at making a genetic change to build more resilience in our animals, what are the climate or nutritional conditions that we are actually selecting for? We're trying to predict something into the future, and we really don't know what that future is going to be. So if we don't know what the future is going to be, how do we make these changes now to start developing animals that are going to be better suited for those environments? What animal traits should we select for, and also what should we be selecting against? There's a lot of debate around the type of things here that we should be looking at. Again, the traditional approach shouldn't be pushed aside, but there's other things that we might need to select for or select against in this area. Another comment that often comes up is it actually doable? So we can have all these things in place, but at the end of the day, will we actually have an outcome that's going to meet our needs? We need to think about the trade-offs that are there. So lifetime productivity versus short-term gains. If we improve growth performance, does it have any negative impact somewhere else? If we select for animals that are more resilient to a harsh climate, does it have impacts on things like, say, fertility? So we need to think about the trade-offs, and we really need to know, or at least have a pretty good understanding of what they may be if we're going to make the progress that we think we might need to make. A lot of discussion around breeds or breed types is probably a better thing we should be looking at. What's available, how are they assessed? How do we assess crossbred animals versus purebred animals, composites, etc.? There's a whole range of things we need to think about in this context as well. And we know that we can do a lot in terms of genetic improvement by infusing breeds together, so we get hybrid vigor and those sort of things happening. And some of that may be a simple way to approach some of the issues that we're dealing with. There's also potential conflicts, and Kieran mentioned about having different conditions across paddocks, and so we know that this will have a big impact on the genetics of the animals. So we often talk about genetic bioenvironmental interactions. So if we change something in the animal, do we need better nutrition to achieve that, whatever that genetic gain is? So there could be a conflict there between what we have environmentally and what we have genetically, and will we actually see that genetic improvement come through in our animals? And of course, things often go wrong. We can have long droughts that will impact on our genetic performance and our ability to make changes. In an ideal world, it would be great, but we know that things will go wrong and can go wrong as we proceed forward. There's also the question of how much change per generation is likely. So there are limitations on what we can actually achieve, both with males and females. And our thinking now is that we really need to have the female assessment in this mix even more than we have in the past to make sure we get that genetic change happening. We are limited by the generation interval of the species we're dealing with, whether it's sheep or cattle or goats. So the generation interval is a key factor in our ability to make the changes that we may want to see. The other question, and I'll touch on this towards the end of my next session, is do we have enough information to actually make sound decisions? What do we need to be measuring? When do we measure it? How do we measure it? How often do we need to measure it? And if we have the information, can we put that together and coalesce it in a way that's going to allow us to make a decision? So just a couple of comments here, and before I move on to the next bit. if we think about a breeding cycle, and in this context, I put breeding cycle from mating a cow, she produces a heifer, that heifer produces a calf. So we're looking at two scenarios. One is 15-month mating in really good environments. And if we look at a 24-month mating, then in either case, we don't have a lot of time. So we've got either 4 or 5 breeding cycles to meet our genetic goal within the next 25 years. That assumes that we've answered all these questions above, we've selected the right traits, we're measuring them correctly, we know what we're doing, and nothing's going to go wrong. So we're really up against it to an extent in this area. It doesn't mean we give up and say it's just too hard, because it is hard, but it's not too hard. We can actually make changes in this area. Okay, so just looking at the importance of trait selection and some of the methods around what we're doing, it's really about building our future herds. And I guess there's a couple of things to think about here also around what we can do on a herd level versus what we can do on an industry level, and how we bring those things together. And we know, we know that if we've got cattle in the Pilbara, it's going to be very different to what we'll be doing, say, if we've got cattle down around Dubbo. So we need to think about these traits and how we measure the things that we want to do. So our traditional breeding approach for a number of years has been around breeding values. So we develop a database of phenotypes, and it's worked really well in our ability to genetically change a lot of breeds of cattle and sheep, but for cattle, I'm concentrating on today. But most of this has been in the more temperate areas. So where we've got smaller properties, smaller herds, we can do a lot more phenotypic recording. And because of that, we've been able to make some very significant genetic change in breeds such as Angus. In the tropics, it's been a bit more difficult to do, and tropics are really more extensive conditions, I guess is what I'm really saying there. So it hasn't been as rapid in that way because of just the inability or the difficulty in collecting the phenotypic data. So the limitations across the board are the inability to really collect the information that we need and to be able to do it accurately and at as early age as possible, because we really want to reduce that generation interval. So the earlier we can make these measurements and determine which animals we want to bring in, then the quicker we'll see the change. There is a cost involved in this, and I'll mention this again, but there's a cost involved. We need large numbers of animals to make any sound decisions. We know that some traits of interest may only be recorded once in life, for something like longevity or one sex. Sometimes, and traditionally, if we wanted meat quality, the animal had to be dead to get that information. There's obviously some differences around that now, but it's really these constraints around phenotypic measurement that limits the amount of genetic progress that we could be made, that we can make through just our conventional selection and breeding methods. Doesn't mean we should say it's too hard and not do it. We need to do it. And even with some of the new things that are out there now, which I'll touch on in a moment, we still need to have that phenotypic measurement. And it comes down again because of that genetics by environment interactions. So molecular genetics, people have heard a lot about this in recent years. So looking at whole genome sequence analysis of animals, we're able then to identify genes that are involved in a variety of traits. And we know that, if we're talking about something like fertility, there's multiple genes involved. We're talking about longevity, there's multiple genes involved. So it's not just a matter of finding one gene and saying we've got it. We're looking at how we can assess the whole animal for its genetic makeup rather than looking at one single trait necessarily. So what the potential here is that we can increase productivity, we can enhance environment at the same time. And that's a key thing, is that we really need to make sure that whatever we do, we don't lose that genetic diversity that's there. We want to still be able to have animals that if we do need to make changes, we can actually make those changes. But the potential is there to actually start to make animals that are more resilient to the environments that they're in. And the other really key factor here is that we can start to do this at a much earlier age with these animals to reduce that generation interval. We can do it really early in the animal's life. There's even potential to do it at the embryo level. And I guess when you start thinking about some of these things, there's still going to be some difficulty around of how we do this. But I just want to give an example of some recent work that's been published. So this came out, I think it's only in July this year, looking at what the Australian Brahman breeders have done in terms of looking at how to improve some of the information that they have and why it's important. And this is why we still need to have that phenotypic information. It's not just going to come down to genomics. The phenotype still has to be there. So I guess the key thing from this slide is, if you look at the light blue line, that was the amount of bulls in 2016 at Rockhampton Brahman Beef Week that had EBVs, and the darker blue line is the ones that had EBVs in 2024. So huge change in terms of the number of bulls presented with EBVs, going from around about 20% or a bit less to over 90% in 9 years. So a big change, more information, more reliability in information, then allows a lot better selection decisions to be made for those animals. Adding genomics into that improves things even more. So what this is showing here is the second column is the EBV accuracy with genomics. So the first column, is number of animals with EBV accuracy of 30% with no genomics. The second line is if we add genomics into that second column, and the third column is the average increase. So we can see by having genomics in there, we can increase the accuracy of the EBV by 26% for gestation lengths, 33% by birth weight, 37% by 200-day weight, and so on. So genomics is going to improve the accuracy of the EBVs. So, yep, so we still need them. It's going to give us better breeding outcomes, and it's going to give us more reliability then in terms of what we are selecting for. So if we are interested then in looking at climate resilience and we want to develop a breeding program for that, we need to look at a whole range of things. We need to look at survivability, fertility, production, whatever that might be, product quality, and we'd also need to ensure that the animals are going to support us economically and be sustainable in the longer run. So if it's not financially sustainable, then why should we do it? Genomic selection is expensive on scale in particular. We still need to have this phenotypic data coming through. Fertility traits in the breeding program obviously should still be the primary selection focus, and we can't lose sight of that. But again, there could be trade-offs one way or the other around this, depending on what we're trying to achieve. And one of the issues around the impact of environment on the animals, and we talk about epigenetics, which Andrew's going to talk about in a moment. So things like dry season weight loss, it's a very neglected trait in many areas around climate adaptation. We know it drives growth, it drives fertility, it drives a whole range of things, but it can have longer term impacts then on the performance of animals, irrespective of the genetics, because of the environmental effects. If anyone's interested more in this, the MLA's got some good information on genetics on their webpage, which I've put there. And yeah, you can have a look, but again, we can talk more about this as we move forward. So I will finish on on that, Vicky, and I'll hand over to Ange.
Thanks, John. And over to you, Ange.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. That should be coming through to you all good now. So I'm going to finish off the back end of today around what we call epigenetics and the impacts on and intergenerational effects. So realistically, this is some learnings from particularly the dairy industry, but there's some evidence there in other species as well. So we'll talk about that as we get through the next couple of slides. So realistically, epigenetics is it's the change in gene expression typically due to some sort of coding factor that alters how we're expressing those proteins. What we're focusing on here is obviously an environmentally driven one. So what I will talk specifically about is heat in focus, but this can be any sort of stress that's happening as an in utero exposure. So in the poultry industry, we talk a lot about nutritional stresses and other things that go into the system. So when we talk about what's happening from an in utero exposure perspective, while the fetus is developing, it's this sort of turning off and turning on of different genes that changes the way the phenotype gets expressed as the animal grows throughout its life. We still sort of really consider this epigenetics as an emerging area, although there's more and more and more information coming out every day around this sort of nexus that's happening there. But what we're going to focus on today is really, again, around that heat stress stuff, and it's really shifting the focus from talking about the direct impacts on here, what we'll talk about, the maternal unit or the cow, and shifting that focus more towards progeny. So realistically, our journey in this area around the impact of heat stress as an epigenetic driver started at the publication of this paper here that you can see in 2019. So at that point in time, we had a very good handle on the fact that we knew there were these direct impacts on cows and feedlot steers and all of the animals, but we didn't really have an understanding of what impacts were happening to the calf at that point in time. We did know that there were some things happening there from an exposure perspective. We knew that typically those calves that had had a late in utero exposure were generally lighter, and we knew that sort of there was a nexus that improved heat tolerance in those animals as well. So there was work that was happening in that area, but we didn't have a very good appreciation of what was happening to these progeny that get exposed in utero. So this is a brand new style of paper. This came out late last year. So this is in Journal of Dairy Science Communications. So there was some work that these guys came out with, and this is out of Jeffrey Dahl's lab out of Florida. From these direct impacts, they sort of described that calves that were born in the hot season or summer versus the cool season impacted the longevity of cows that were retained within the herd. And that impact there was driven right through to 5 lactations. And I've got a copy there of the graphical abstract associated with that paper. So you can see quite nicely that longevity, or the time at which those cows are retained in the herd, is a lot longer for those animals that are born during the cool season. But they also then associated some health implications from these calves that were born across those two, the hot season and the cool season. So some of this is health-related challenges. So those calves that were born in the hot seasons were more likely to develop mastitis and have some health concerns. But they were also associated with more foot and lameness and leg challenges in those animals, and also had reduced reproductive capacity. Well, this is the data that's coming out of that information. So we know that there's those direct impacts on the calf and as she grows through her productive life as well. And that's something that has been reported for a very long time. This is just something that's sort of reiterating that particular component of the story. When we talk about epigenetics and the impact, not only on that first generation of the calf, we can also start to see subsequent generation changes as well. So again, this is some data that comes out of Jeffrey Dahl's lab out of the University of Florida. So what these guys did in these experiments that I'm talking to you about now was they exposed dams to heat stress, so that calf is getting a late gestation in utero heat stress exposure. So these guys, in the initial work that they did, were looking at the impact of that dam itself and its exposure to heat stress and the production impacts that it had on her as an individual. But then they also followed that calf through from birth through to the second lactation. Now, what they came out with in this work was that that dry period exposure in the maternal unit or the cow is generally coinciding with that last trimester, so a big phase of growth for that fetus. So that heat stress exposure was driving reduced placental size. It ties back into reduced blood flow to the uterus, so reduced feeding of that calf as it's developing in that final stages of gestation. The other things that came out with this was that tissue development in particular, so the growth of skeletal tissues was impacted, and also there's some impacts to the maturation of internal organs and the development of the gut as well. So on those calves out of these heat stress dams, as I said before, we've always kind of known that these calves are lighter at birth, but they quantified that in this study here, and they typically were about 5 kilos lighter at birth, and that kept extrapolating out to weaning, where they were about 10 kilos lighter. With that organ maturation and development of that last trimester of gestation, there's a lot of immune development that goes into the preparing of that fetus. And so these animals were also deemed as what we call immunocompromised. So they weren't as immune developed as a young animal between that sort of young phase of life, but also then persists into later life. And then you can also see in the figure that's on this particular slide here that there's a quantification around the progeny's first and second lactations. And you can see quite nicely the difference between the blue and the red lines there around production outcomes from those heifers in their first and second lactation. The other thing that these guys had a look at with this data set was that they had a look at animals being retained within the population as well. So what they were able to quantify was that daughters that came out of heat stress dams had a reduced survivability in the herd, and that reduced survivability was at every major marker in a dairy cow's life. So less at weaning, less at that first AAI, less at first calving, and then through to subsequent lactations as well. And the general metric that they put around these is that they actually had a reduced lifespan in those animals as well. Now, the production impact on those daughters as well, you can see the metrics here on the slide. So they've quantified that out to 3 lactations, and you can see a substantive decline in lactational yield as they get through their first, second, and third lactation. The important caveat to take into consideration here is that when these cows are entering their lactational life, they are all treated the same way, so that these differences that we see in the lactational yields are tied up into those epigenetic drivers that happened while they were in utero. Now, the really interesting stuff that comes out of this work is that this impact persists through to granddaughters or the second generation as well. So we see that survivability index and that reduced survivability again through those major markers in a dairy cow's lifetime and impacts through to the 4th lactational period. I've also put some metrics up there that's come out of these papers as well. So, 25% of these calves aren't surviving until weaning, which is 8 weeks of life in a dairy enterprise. So we do see that substantive impact on that survivability of these particularly young animals. And then again, those metrics are there through some major markers in a dairy cow's life. Again, the caveats here is that these cows and from the F1 generation or the first generation, they also have been treated the same way. So these cows, these progeny, these granddaughters, while they were in utero, have had access to cooling mechanisms. So that epigenetic driver is really coming from that original generation exposure. The other interesting stuff here is that these lactational impacts are persisting through to this granddaughter generation. So again, we've got the metrics there for lactational yield differences for the first, second, and third lactations there. It might not seem like an awful lot at a per day unit, but when you extrapolate these metrics out over a 305-day lactational yield, they do start to come out as fairly substantive numbers from a economics and sustainability concept. So, I know, and I often say this an awful lot too, that perhaps we shouldn't be relying on dairy information for beef cows. Sometimes we should treat them as different species because productivity-wise, they're very different animals and they do some things very different metabolically. But the reality of this particular story and what happens in this heat stress concept is that we are seeing similar things across other species as well. So we certainly see similar sorts of things come out in the poultry space. And this is something that has been known for a very long time. And the simplicity of it is that you can take 10,000 eggs and put them in an incubator and treat them all the same way and get a very good handle of what's happening between generations very quickly. As John said before, that generation interval is very short in poultry. So there's a very good understanding in the poultry industries around the impacts of heat stress and drivers of that in egg or in utero for us, what's happening at that development stage and the impacts that has on production and productivity. Steph introduced us very nicely last week to some nice work that's coming out of Arizona in sheep. And so what we would say is that the impacts to sheep appear to be very similar to what we're seeing from dairy industry. And this infographic that comes out of that manuscript is very nice. So again, we've got that really big impact on placental weight, and that's really responsible for feeding that calf and looking after that fetus as it's developing, and that's then having those impacts on birth weights, and also then we're seeing that impact and driver to production yields as well. We are seeing more information come out from pig perspective as well, and again, those outcomes appear to be fairly similar. And the thing that I would also add here from a pig's perspective is that we are starting to see some evidence on reduced carcass quality impacts from those epigenetic drivers and in utero exposure. It's not a solid story yet, but there is certainly some indication that there is some impact on some of those carcass metrics that we feel that we mark as important in this concept as well. The other thing that I wanted to touch very briefly on, and we've sort of alluded to it throughout this seminar series, is this concept around multiple stresses. And this is, again, probably taking the focus back onto that grazing context as well. If you think about, the average cow that's walking around in the northern herds, for example, there's a lot of stresses that go onto her as a part of her lifetime, whether we're talking about, seasonal fluctuations, drought, floods, changing environments. So one thing that we do need to be mindful of is this nexus that happens with multiple stresses. And so again, if we think about that average cow, we often think that, there's some nutritional drivers there. Phosphorus deficiency is a big issue for us in this country. We've got these climatic stresses, and then we also have what we would term as walking stress or locomotory stress. So if that cow's got to walk 5 or 10 k's out to water, there's an additional workload and stress that's happening to the system there that might be sort of impacting her more than just these, when in conjunction with these other stresses, than if it was just a standalone stress in itself. So that's where this concept of multiple stresses come in. And I've got a nice little infographic here. And effectively what the story is telling you is that when a cow or an animal gets exposed to a single stress, the system and the body seems to be able to cope with and deal with that pretty well. But when we start adding 2, 3, 4 or more stresses to the system, they tend to start to struggle through that a little bit more, and they take more energy away from other systems like reproduction and immune function and those productivity outputs that we want to see in these animals, and they divert that energy towards managing that stress. So we, as producers, would then see reduced productivity in our animals when we're starting to put multiple stresses on the load on that body. Now, while we don't have a very good handle of this from a cow perspective, we certainly have some colleagues in India that have been working on this in sheep and goats. And we know that this multiple stresses concept and has an impact on productivity. It has an impact on reproduction. Whether it has an intergenerational impact, we're not entirely sure at the current moment in time. But certainly, the more stresses we load on animals, the more impact and the greater impact we see on productive outcomes. So just to bring it back again a little bit, when we're talking about this in utero exposure, particularly from those dairy systems, effectively what we're doing is programming that fetus, and all evidence is telling us that we're programming a less productive phenotype. There's a magnitude of reasons for that. Some of it is from that tissue development. They tell us too that a lot of the new work that's coming out of the US and the dairy systems is telling us that even things like mammary tissue development is impacted in a young calf, and that those mammary tissues just aren't developing as well as what a non-heat stressed counterpart would be. We also know that this less productive phenotype is also less viable in the long term. So that survivability index, they're leaving those herds at an earlier rate in comparison to their non-stressed counterparts. And we're seeing those production impacts over the first and second generation through at least to those third lactation periods. And the data's all here, and we can share that with you. But we know that over those major markers in a dairy cow's lifetime, that we're seeing these impacts, and these animals that are being tied back to a heat stress challenge are having a reduced survivability in those production systems. Now, Vicky, I'm going to pull up stumps there. That's all I wanted to cover off on today. So that passes back to you to finish us up.
Thank you so much, Angela. I always love listening to what you have to say, and I think it's a very interesting area going forward. As I mentioned earlier today, unfortunately, we are not proceeding with the field days next week. We will be looking to incorporate them later on in the year. However, we are going to run with a 4th webinar next week, and that will be a very interactive Q&A session where we will cover off on a lot of the questions that have been coming through both in the registrations and in the chat there. We're also going to take a look at those seasonal outlooks for the up and coming season, and also some of those longer term projections as well. But I'm sure you would have discovered over these last 3 webinars that one where we started right back in webinar 1, where we looked at what drives those accumulated thermal load events and those heat load events, and how important it is to be also monitoring for minimum temperature, not just maximum temperature, as well as that humidity and that lack of wind speed when we're talking about heat, or that wind speed when we're talking about chill. And then in webinar 2, we were able to tie that over then to learn about how our livestock actually shift that energy from those non-essential production in them, so those pregnancies or weight gain and growth, over to that thermal regulation regulation and just how important it is for the animals to actually cool the brain, that it's not about cooling the body as per se, it's actually about, they're looking to cool their brain first. And that's why, we need to pay a little bit of attention to observing that panting and understanding that we're seeing them with that panting. They've shifted that energy into trying to then cool that brain and regulate that body temperature there. And, that it can be a very good thing just to pull up and stop that locomotion movement in those animals. And of course, Steph talked about the importance of lung health and how that gut and lung is interconnected there. So really looking after those nutritional aspects and trying to prevent any of those respiratory problems going forward, so those animals can actually pant more efficiently and cope and use their lungs to capacity for thermal regulation. And then of course today we've looked at these epigenetic drivers and this generational interval. It's something that we should all start to pay attention to going forward and managing for these multiple stresses so that we are setting up our livestock, not just our current livestock, but those multi-generational stocks. So in next week, the panel of experts, we're going to go to a live Q&A session after we cover off on the seasonal outlooks. Some of the great questions we've had coming through is, such as we calve lamb and kid during the hottest months. Could you please address the best management practices you've found for managing weaner animals during cold, windy and stormy conditions? Great question. And that is a problem that we all face if you're starting to wean into those autumn months and winter months. And then we've had one question coming through. The nighttime minimum temperatures in our area hardly ever get low enough in summer for cattle and sheep to unload the accumulated heat. How should producers handle this? So we're going to look at those sort of questions in next week's, as well as those far more complex ones. So, what is the impact impacts going forward that are likely. So if you haven't, you'll see in the chat there, Ali's put up a link to next week's register. I highly recommend you registering and coming along. We'll send out a recording today, and at the close of next week's webinar, we'll also hand you over all the links to each of the recordings, plus some of those links that you've found throughout the presentations, and a copy of a PDF of each of the presentations there for you to keep in your toolbox going forward. I'd like to thank you all very much for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you next week. And please, when the webinar's finished today, just take that 1 minute to complete that short survey that's up. It really does help us be able to show our funders that the money that they're investing in projects like the Northern Australian Climate Program are beneficial and reaching producers. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, presenters, and have a great day.